Okay, good morning, students. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sir, you're
Yes,
audible.
sir.
Okay, so I am sharing the screen. I hope you can see this screen.
Sure.
Yes,
Can you?
sir. We can
Can
see.
you? Okay, good. Okay, good. Okay, so this is the link for the attendance you have to keep for today. Uh, okay, so can you just switch on your video? According to a circular, students need to switch on the video, at least those who can. Okay, because this meeting is being recorded. Yeah, that's good. Okay, those students who can, please switch on the video. Okay, let us discuss. So in the last class we discussed what is a disaster, what is a hazard. So the basic difference between a hazard and a disaster is that a hazard, supposedly a natural hazard, is purely a natural event, and the hazard has a probability of occurrence, and the hazard can be measured, or the magnitude of the hazard can be measured by the indicators. So there may be various indicators with which you can measure the magnitude of a hazard. For example, the magnitude of an earthquake can be measured. So we measure it in terms of the amount of energy that is being released when the earthquake strikes. For example, last night there was an earthquake, and then if you check on the property of the earthquake, if you go to a website known as USGS earthquakes, so it is mentioned that the earthquake had an epicenter in Hazu, so it is in Assam, and then it occurred around 10 kilometers beneath the ground. And then the amount of energy that was released during this earthquake was equivalent to an earthquake of being 4.4 magnitude in the Richter scale. So all these hazards can be measured in terms of their magnitude. Similarly, for a flood hazard, the magnitude is normally measured in terms of various attributes, such as the volume of water that is being released into the river, or the depth of water at a particular location or in the floodplains, or the duration that the flood water stayed in the floodplains, or the velocity of water, or in some cases it may be the momentum of water, or even the sedimentation load that the flood carries. So all these hazards, they can be measured. One of an important unit how this hazard is also measured is in terms of the return period. So when somebody says that, okay, this is a flood of 100-year return period, that is an indication of the magnitude of the flood. So this is a common magnitude which is actually used in order to compare between the severity of the floods that may happen in different basins, or even within a particular basin. If there are floods that occur in different years, somebody can compare it in terms of the return period. So what is a return period? Okay, so return period is simply the reciprocal of the probability of occurrence, or simply, if you suppose if you say that a flood is of 100-year return period, yeah. So if you say that the flood is of 100 year period, that means it has a probability of occurrence of 1 divided by 100. So how much is 1 divided by 100? 0.01. That means this flood or that particular flood has a probability of 0.01 uh, percent of occurrence starting from year number 1 up to 100 years. So if, for example, there is a flood which you can say it is of 10-year return period, then 1 by 10 is 0.1. Okay, so the smaller the return period, higher is the probability, and higher is the return period, smaller is the probability. So this is analogous with the rule of nature that rare incidences, they do not occur very frequently, or very severe or extreme examples of natural events, they have a very less likelihood or very less probability of occurrence. Okay, so this is according to the rule of nature. So please remember, so up to this point, the things that we have to remember is that hazard is a natural event, especially the natural hazard. That means a flood is a natural event, an earthquake is a natural event, a tsunami is a natural event. Nothing is unnatural of these things. So the moment these natural events, they cross our day-to-day lives in an adverse or negative way, okay, at that point of time the hazard actually translates into a disaster. So if there is an earthquake that is happening in the middle of an ocean and it is not touching my life directly, I would not say that this is a disaster for me. But if there is an earthquake that happens in the middle of Guwahati town and then suddenly we are all sufferers, for us it will be a disaster. Okay, so second thing is that these natural events always they will occur, but with every occurrence of these natural events there is a probability that is attached. Okay, so that probability means it may happen or it may not happen. So all these events are actually stochastic in nature. We call it probabilistic or stochastic. So nothing in nature is deterministic. Deterministic means you can say for certain that this thing is going to happen for sure, 100% certainty. You cannot say. So if, for example, even if I ask you, is it going to rain today? So it is already raining. But a few hours ago, if I would have asked you, you would have looked at the sky and said that, okay, probably it is going to rain. So probably means there is a chance of occurrence. And then this chance can be measured in terms of numbers. Okay, so these all natural events, they do have a probability of occurrence. So the moment I say the word hazard, you should be able to connect these things. What will you connect? It has a probability of occurrence. Okay, so the bigger the hazard, okay, second thing is that one, the bigger these hazards can be measured in terms of their magnitudes. The bigger the magnitude, less is the probability. And then we find out a way to compare between these natural events in terms of their magnitudes by giving it a terminology such as the return period. Okay, a higher the return period, it means it is a bigger magnitude event, and then at the same time it has got a very less likelihood of occurrence, and vice versa. Okay, okay, so if you look at this slide here, These are the examples of some of the hazards. So it can be categorized into different categories. For example, you can categorize according to the origin of the hazard, such as the geological hazard, water and climatic hazards, environmental hazards, biological, or chemical, industrial, nuclear, or even the list may become bigger. Just an example, so I needn't have to really explain about these things, you know already. Earthquake, landslide, tsunamis, dam burst, volcanic eruption, mine fire, all this can be combined within geological hazards. Then water and climatic hazards include cyclones, especially the tropical cyclones, cloudburst, floods, heat and cold waves, drought, snow and avalanche, hailstorm. Okay, so if anyone doesn't understand some of these terminologies, please let me know by now. So I hope that you all know what is a cyclone. As in the last class also we had a chance to discuss. Cyclone actually occurs because of a depression or a sudden lowering of the atmospheric pressure. So if there is by somehow some air is being sucked out from the atmosphere at a certain area, then immediately what will happen? The pressure will drop, because we all experience the pressure, okay, because of the air above us. So if you just suck out the air for somehow, then there will be a reduction in the pressure. That means the pressure, whatever we are experiencing, we will not experience that. And then because of this reduction of pressure, the neighborhood air will just try to fill up those void spaces. And in the process, a cyclone forms. And if the cyclone forms, it tries to travel from one place to another, and then the moment it comes to the coastal areas, and then it crosses these land forms, uh, we call it as a cyclonic event. But these are just the terminologies. So if this thing happens in the Bay of Bengal, or in the coastal areas of Orissa or Andhra Pradesh, these things we name it as a cyclone. The same thing, or whatever depression, if someone experiences who is in Japan or in Taiwan or in the east of Asia, so this thing will be named as a typhoon. Similar thing if it happens in the Mexican Gulf or in the Caribbeans, it is named as a hurricane. Okay, so there is a slight difference between a cyclone and a tornado. So the tornado, the same thing happens, but it travels from land, inside the land, or from land to the sea. So the origin of a tornado is inside the land, but the other things is originate normally in or above the waters in the ocean or the sea. Okay, so what is a cloud burst? Anyone has an idea what is a cloud burst? Cloud burst is normally what happens whenever there is a rainfall, you have to have clouds. Okay, so if there is a sudden accumulation of a lot of cloud, and then suddenly a lot of water is being released, so remember this is actually a very localized event. So for example, if in Panikhati area or above our university itself, there is sudden accumulation of a lot of clouds, and then suddenly all these clouds starts to rain, then it can be said as a cloud burst. So it has to have this particular uh, property that a lot of water has to be released suddenly. So normally a cloud burst actually triggers a flood, and sometimes if there is a dam at an upstream of a river, and in the upstream of the basin there is a sudden release of water due to the cloud burst, then the dam's gates have to be released automatically so that the accumulated water has to go away. Otherwise, there is a chance that the dam may burst. And then, if there is a dam burst, you can imagine what may happen in the downstream areas. Similarly, we have floods. So, floods also, we do have different categories of floods. Like there is a seasonal floods or riverine floods that happen normally when there is a river during the monsoon. The water is there that is actually falling in the floodplains, and then a part of the water actually goes inside the land, and then fill up those aquifers. Okay, and then gradually during the monsoon time, these voids gets filled up and filled up and filled up, and there is a time that comes that any amount of water the arch cannot accumulate or accommodate. And then especially during the later month of the monsoon, suppose there is a flood, there is a this kind of a rainfall that is happening today, the land is already saturated. Saturated means it can no longer accumulate or accommodate any further water. So however small amount of water that may fall right now, what will happen? It will just travel on the land. Okay, so this water that travels on the land, in terms of civil engineering, we call it as an overland flow or runoff. And this runoff actually is the floods that we talk about. Sometimes this thing may happen in the initial months of the monsoon also, because if there is a sudden amount of rainfall that happens, the rate at which the water should be sucked into the ground, it is less than the rate at which the water is falling over land, then obviously, even the land is not saturated enough, there would be a portion of the floods or the water that will translate into an overland flow. So even in those times there will be floods. Okay, these are the normal processes of nature, and these floods we term as riverine floods or seasonal floods. So as according to the season you analyze these incidences, you will see that the river will swell and then it will subside. So this process may happen once in a year, or this process may happen twice in a year. Okay, so these are very natural events. We call it as a riverine floods. Some of the other examples of floods are someone who is actually near to the coast, he or she experiences a different kinds of flooding or floods. What is that? So if there is a cyclone, so together with the wind, a lot of water actually has been sucked into the atmosphere, and then the moment the cyclonic storm comes to the coastal areas, this water is being released, okay, over the land. This is known as surcharge or storm surge. So this actually contributes to a lot of water being dumped on the land at a very small amount of time, and then ultimately there becomes flood. This is also a part of cyclonic storm surge or floods, who is near to the coastal areas, and it's a part of the coastal floods. So coastal floods, they do occur even without these cyclones. Sometimes during the high tide, okay, the water actually, because of the wave action, it comes and hits the coastal areas, and then you have the floods. So another floods may be because of the earthquake and the in the in the bottom of the river oceanic floor. So earthquake suddenly, it what does it do? It breaks the fault in a certain section, and the part of the ocean gets up, another part goes down, and together with this action, a column of water will rise, and then it will start to move towards the coastal areas. This is also known as tsunamis or killer waves. Tsunami is a Japanese word, so this literal meaning is killer wave. So if there is a tsunami, a high rise of water column actually starts to move towards the coastal belt, and then ultimately you know what happens during a tsunami. Another kind of floods is the urban flood that we all experience. What is that? Uh, Normally, if you live in an urbanized area or an area where there is a lot of concretization that has happened, this pores or the voids through which the water has a chance to go inside the art, it is no more, because already we have transformed these voids into non-porous areas by doing concretization. Whenever there is a road, this is being built upon this art. If you have a lot of houses built, if you have a lot of roads that are being built, If you have an area which is already been concretized, like runways or airfields and those kind of things, uh, so there is hardly any chance that the water actually gets a chance to go inside to recharge this aquifer. So whatever small amount of rainfall that happens, a major part of this rainfall actually translates into runoff or overland flow. So this is one of the examples is in Guwahati city. Guwahati city is not only because of this concretization, but a lot of other activities are also there. But one of the factors of this urban flooding is concretization. So another problem of urban flooding may be inadequate drainages. This is all we know. So if there is a drain, it cannot carry really water. What will happen? We all know it, right? So another floods. What may be the other kind of floods? In other times, if you are residing in hilly areas, then you will experience that within a very short duration from the starting of the rainfall, you will experience flooding. This is because of many factors. One of the factors being a very steep gradient or steep slope in those areas. Okay, so this is also known as, what is it, flash flooding. So technically speaking, if within 6 hours of rainfall there are floods that happen in this basins, we call it as this thing, flash floods. Okay, floods are normally experienced in the areas where you have hilly places. Okay, then heat and cold waves you all see these days. Now last year also, uh, it was an year which experienced extreme heat, and then at the same time parts of the world were extremely cold. So because of the cold, many places in the US, including New York, and then those places that are in the north, the schools and colleges and then many of the institutions had to shut down. So these are bouts of cold waves which were unprecedented, and then it is actually attributed to the change in the climate. Drought is also a kind of water and climatic hazard, but actually, if drought, we are talking about drought, it is the devoid of water. Okay, so actually drought is, again, it can be categorized as a long-term hazard. So it happens over a longer duration of time. You have a stress for the water, and it is being shown in the plants and the trees, and also it is being felt by the productivity of the crops, that it is known as an agricultural drought. Okay, so there are three, four kinds of droughts. Snow and avalanches, it's like a landslide that happens when you have a snowy environment. The volume of snow just gushes towards you or towards the down slope because the slope fails for some reason. This is an action of snow avalanche. Hailstorm, so sometimes together with the rain you have very big size uh, balls of ice that comes together. This is known as the hailstorm. Okay, then some of these hazards are environmental hazards, environmental pollutions, desertification, deforestation, pest infection. So all these things, if you look at this list, you will see that these events are quite natural, and then all these events, they do have a probability of occurrence. Okay. Okay. Uh, Again, the hazards can be categorized into either it is natural or non-natural. So if you look at this slide, you will see that some of these hazards, if the triggering factor actually is nature, then it is, or it can be categorized as a natural hazard. Other than that, if it is purely of anthropogenic reasons, or if the triggering factor is by humans, it is a human hazard. So examples may be some of the accidents or terrorist attacks or wars. All the normally the humans, they start these things, and some are in between, which are natural as well as human. So droughts and floodings are one of the examples, because flooding the humans, they change the conditions which are actually favorable for flooding, and then in due course flooding happens. Okay, drought also, if you just take down the trees, and then many of these things which are actually helping the drought action to happen, so probably it can be categorized into the second type of hazards. Okay, so disaster, according to the UNISDR's definition, a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, or economic and environmental losses and impacts, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. So, okay, so this last line, when it says which exceeds the ability of the affected community, uh, later on I will show you that there are some of the disaster charters. So what are the disaster charters means? So these are some of these organizations which keep a track of the disasters that keep on happening around the world. For example, if there is an earthquake that happens in Guwahati city, and probably there are buildings which are being damaged, probably there are people who are being killed, or activities are being disrupted. So we know that these have actually crossed our lives in an indirect way, or we are experiencing the uh, negative consequences of this natural hazard. But even then, will it be termed as a disaster or not? So there are some of the disaster portals which do have their own categorization, whether this incident can be categorized as a disaster or not. So some of these disaster charters, they have one of their criteria is that the moment the country is unable to cope with these incidences with their own capacity, or the moment the country asks for an international help, at that point of time they record this thing as a disaster. For example, in the earthquake in Haiti, okay, in the Caribbean, the country was already very poor, and then the magnitude of the earthquake was too big. The infrastructure were completely flattened, people were killed, and at that point of time the country said that okay, we really need international help. So this help, the moment the country says at that point of time, it is being recorded as a disaster. So in order for the disaster charters to record this, you need to know that the country has to declare that they are unable to cope up using their own resources. Okay? This is one serious uh, definition. Okay, so again the disaster can be categorized. Now we are coming into from hazard to disaster. Okay, that means that the hazard has already happened and then it has actually started to do the damage. So there may be some of the slow onset disasters, for examples, drought, pest infection, famine, or some of the environmental degradations which doesn't really occur within overnight, or it takes a longer duration to show up its effects. So in this case, you can say that these are some of the slow onset disasters. Some are, on the other hand, are very rapid, and then you can see the effects quite immediately, triggered by an instantaneous shock. For example, earthquake. So if there is a major earthquake, immediately by the morning you will see that everyone is at a hue and cry. Cyclone is another example. Floods, okay. Volcanic eruptions. So all these actually can be triggered into rapid onset disasters. Okay. Again, we're talking since about disasters. There may be some of the natural disasters or some of the disasters which are induced by humans. So this you can see the example together we have given caused by natural hazards, other natural disasters. 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Can you tell me when exactly did it happen? Which day? Anyone? Which day did it happen? Indian Ocean tsunami. Do you think India was affected by this? Hmm? Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So, I don't know how old you may be by that time. 2004, Indian Ocean tsunami. It happened in December. And then
So 19.
December, which day? 24 or 26?
6, sir.
Okay. So it was a very major disaster in the Indian Ocean countries. Okay. And later on, you will see that how this disaster actually contributed to a lot of loss of lives because of the differential vulnerability among the Indian population. Okay. Again, we have there was an earthquake in China in 2008 in the western provinces, Xinjiang. 2007, there was a cyclone in Myanmar, which is also known as a Nargis. So all these are examples of actually hazards that were being translated into severe disasters. Okay. Then there are human-induced disasters. Oh, sorry. One of the examples were in 1984, Bhopal gas tragedy. Similar incident just happened this year when there was a gas leak, and then in the southern India, a lot of people actually were killed. Similar incident in Upahar cinema fire in New Delhi. So all these are actually examples of human-induced disasters. So this is actually the same slide that actually emphasizes this difference between a hazard and a disaster. So as long as the hazard happens somewhere in an area that were not inhabited by people, it's no longer a disaster. But the moment it crosses our day-to-day lives, it is a disaster. Okay. Now we come to a very important terminology in the subject, which is known as the vulnerability. Okay. So again, if I say that the moment I utter the word hazard, the thing that you have to remember is it has a probability of occurrence. The moment I say the word disaster, you think that you have to remember is that it is basically the degree of damage or the degree of loss. Understand? Hazard is the probability of loss. Disaster is the degree of loss or degree of damage, whatever you want to say. Oh, sorry. Vulnerability is the degree of damage. So since we are going to start the word vulnerability, let us discuss what is vulnerability. So just give me an example. Start with this example. Suppose there are two of your friends, okay, or including you, or maybe you have one friend, so there are two people. Both of these friends are staying near to a river. Okay, so one of you do have a house which is an RCC house, or RCC means reinforced cement concrete, and then the other person, your friend or maybe you, he or she stays in a house which is made of bamboo. Okay, take an example. Suppose there is a flood that happens in the floodplain. Okay, so both of you are affected, and then for example, if the flood water stays for about 1 month, so which according to you do you think will be more affected or will experience a greater degree of damage? The one who has a RCC house or one who stays in the bamboo house? Which one? Yes?
Wow.
Yes?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, who is? Yeah, I need an answer. Who, according to you?
Yes, sir. Bamboo house.
Bamboo house. Okay. So, actually, this is the essence of vulnerability. Because someone is staying in an RCC house, he or she may be protected more against this threat. Okay, this threat is maybe an external threat or it may be an internal threat. So by staying in a kind of house, you are more secured against this threat. That means your level of vulnerability is less. Similar ways, you can say that your friend or whoever is staying in the bamboo house probably will be more exposed to the threat because of the way or the construction material uh, with which this house has been built. If the floodwater stays there for 1 month, obviously the RCC house, if it is obviously constructed in a proper way, it will be able to withstand this hazard, but the bamboo house probably will not be able to withstand this hazard if it is going to prolong for another 1 month. So that means your vulnerability increases, right? Again, so this time let us take this example. Both of you have the similar type of a house. Hmm? Your friend as well as yourself, you both have, suppose, bamboo house. Hmm? And then the flood water actually in your particular house, it is maybe not even 1 meter, maybe 0.5 meter. So you have to quickly imagine how much may be 0.5 meter. Okay, 1 meter is 3.28 feet, so half of that. And then you in your friend's house, this flood water is up to 2 meters, so it's more than 6 feet. So in this case, where do you think or which house will experience a bigger degree of damage? You or your friend? Hmm? Oh, why no answer? See, again, I want to really emphasize this fact that you have to first switch on your videos and you have to really engage in the classroom. The moment I ask a question, I need questions, answers from you. Okay? Because this is not a physical classroom. In the physical classroom, I at least can make a guess by looking at the faces. So the moment I ask to throw a question, at least there must be someone who should come forward with an answer. It may not be correct because this is a, as I said, this is a master's level course. We have to proceed with questions and answers and then an interaction with both the directions. So tell me, first of all, have you got my question? Understood my question? This second time. Now, second time, if you have the similar
Sir,
houses, yeah,
sir, can you repeat the question?
repeat the question.
Yes, sir. Sir, because of the
Okay,
network, I can't hear properly.
okay, so let me repeat this question, reframe the question again. So I had a previous question where I asked there are two houses. One is an RCC house, another one is a bamboo house. And then the flood water, it stayed for same duration of time. So I asked you which house will experience a greater damage. And then the answer was that the house which was made of bamboo will experience a greater damage. Okay, so the second question. There are two houses, both are made of bamboo, okay, or mud houses, or you can say, um, yeah, mud houses. And now this time you have a flood water of different depths. Both the houses are experiencing. The first house, it has a flood water of suppose about 1.5 feet, okay, and then the next house experiences a flood water which is more than 6 feet. So which house has to experience a greater damage according to your general knowledge? Which one?
So the 5 feet one.
Yeah, the one with the bigger depth, right? So again you see, even if the construction material is the same, due to the different properties or the attributes of the hazard, the amount of damage may be different. Initially, it was because of the different properties of construction material. The amount of damage may be different. This time, the construction material is same, but because of the different attributes of flood or different magnitudes of flood, the degree of damage or the amount of damage may be different. So this degree of damage actually points to or implies the essence of vulnerability. Again, when I talk about vulnerability, it is a very uh, interesting subject. At the same time, it crosses or actually incorporates different fields. So there may be a physical vulnerability, there may be economic vulnerability, there is a social vulnerability. At the same time, there may be emotional vulnerability. Can you give me an example of emotional vulnerability? Sometimes when you were a newcomer into the college or a university, the moment you go into a hostel life, there are some people who can cope up with the hostel life pretty easily, but there are some others who cannot. So this is actually because their level of emotional vulnerability are different. Okay, there may be physical vulnerability. So the example that I just given now is an example of physical vulnerability. The example of the house, different construction materials, or if the house is a one-story house or if it is a multi-story house. If you were staying in a house which is of a double-story house, if there are flood waters that comes inside the house, you can bring the stuff and then put it into the first floor. So the amount of damage inside the house, particularly the content damage, will be less. Why? Because this house is a double-story house and you have the scope that you can keep those materials in the first floor. You can at least save those materials. But suppose your friend who has the same fridge, who has the same sofa set, who has the same television set, or who has the same utensils in the kitchen, he is staying in a single-story house and suddenly the flood water just gushes inside the house. He doesn't have a scope so that he can save those things inside the house. So this time your friend has a greater vulnerability because of not the material of the house, because the type of house, because it is not a single, it is a single story house. Had it been a double story house like you would have also been able to save those contents. Okay, so it is a very interesting subject, vulnerability, and I assume that those from social sciences will be even more interesting, or it will be more interesting for them because you will see a lot of things and you can connect those into uh, this greater explanation of vulnerability. So these are because of the physical properties. So this is known as a physical vulnerability, may be determined by the aspects such as the population density. Okay, we can also discuss population density. If a flood that comes in the Dhaka city, obviously there would be a greater casualty. But if the same magnitude of flood that comes somewhere in Australian cities where you don't have enough population, where in sometimes in one town you have only 2-3 number of people, so the degree of damage will be definitely less. Okay, remoteness of a settlement, that is also if you are staying near to the coastal belt or far away from the ocean, definitely it will affect the site also. Again, the same thing. Design and materials used for critical infrastructure, like as I said, if it is a concrete house, RCC house, or if it is a bamboo house, okay, this will determine the degree of damage. And again, I remember I asked you the moment I said the word vulnerability.